my goodness, my wife is cheating at me after 12 years of marriage. No, I must find out who this ugly man is.
David was proud of the life he had built. For 12 years, he had worked every day as a transport supervisor in Port Harcourt, leaving home early in the morning and returning in the evening with tired legs but a full heart. His wife, Grace, always greeted him with a warm smile and a calm voice that made the stress of the outside world fade away. Their small house was simple but peaceful. In the evenings, they often sat together on the veranda, talking about the future while the quiet night breeze moved through the street. David believed he was a lucky man. Many men complained about their marriages, but he believed his own marriage was built on trust and loyalty. Grace often told him she admired his dedication and the sacrifices he made for their family, and those words strengthened his sense of purpose. Grace was calm, intelligent, and careful with her words. She worked as a sales representative who often traveled to other cities for business meetings, sometimes staying away for several days. David never questioned it. In fact, he respected her ambition and independence. He believed marriage was built on trust, not suspicion. His friends sometimes joked that women who traveled too much could not always be trusted, but David would always defend his wife with pride. Grace is not that kind of woman, he would say confidently. To him, she was loyal, responsible, and devoted. Every memory he had with her felt real and strong. At that time, David never imagined that the life he admired so much was only half the truth. One quiet afternoon, while David was repairing a broken chair in the living room, his phone rang with an unknown number. Normally, he ignored calls from unfamiliar numbers, but something pushed him to answer this one. A woman's voice spoke calmly from the other side of the phone. "Good afternoon. Please, can I speak to Grace?" she asked politely. David told her that Grace was not home and asked who was calling. The woman hesitated for a moment before answering. "My name is Miriam. I'm trying to reach my husband's wife. Grace should understand if you give her this message." The sentence sounded strange, and David felt a small confusion form in his mind. David laughed nervously, believing the woman had made a mistake. "You must have the wrong number," he said gently. But the woman sounded certain. She repeated Grace's full name, her job, and even described her appearance correctly. David's smile slowly disappeared as the words sank into his mind. Miriam calmly explained that her husband had been living with Grace in another city for several years and that she recently discovered the truth. She said she was calling because she wanted to confront Grace. When the call ended, David sat silently in the chair for a long time, staring at the phone in disbelief. The peaceful house around him suddenly felt unfamiliar, as if the walls themselves were hiding something from him. For the first time in 12 years, David began to question the details of his own life. Memories that once seemed normal now started to look suspicious. Grace's frequent business trips suddenly appeared longer than he remembered. The cities she traveled to, the weekends she sometimes spent away, and the time she returned home tired but quiet, all came back to him like pieces of a puzzle he had never noticed before. David tried to convince himself that the woman on the phone was lying or confused. Yet, a small voice inside him kept repeating the same frightening question: what if it is true? That evening, Grace returned home from work like any other day. She greeted David warmly and placed her bag on the table. Her voice sounded normal and her smile looked genuine. David watched her carefully, searching for any sign of guilt or deception. But Grace behaved exactly the way she always had. They ate dinner together and she talked about a meeting she would attend in another city the following week. David nodded quietly, pretending everything was normal. Inside, his chest was a storm of confusion and fear, growing stronger with every minute. For the first time in their marriage, he realized he did not truly know the woman sitting across from him. The next few days felt heavy and slow. David continued his daily routine, but his mind was no longer peaceful. One evening, after Grace fell asleep, he quietly opened Grace's travel bag to look for something that might explain the strange phone call. Inside, he found ordinary items, documents, clothing, and business papers. But beneath those things, he discovered a small envelope containing photographs. When he looked closely, his hands began to shake. The photos showed Grace standing beside a man David had never seen before. In some pictures, they were smiling together in front of a house. In others, two young children stood beside them like a happy family. David's heart pounded loudly as he studied the pictures. The children looked comfortable with Grace, holding her hand and laughing beside her. These were not strangers. They looked like people who shared daily life together. At that moment, the truth began to feel less like a possibility and more like a painful reality. Still, David refused to believe everything without seeing it himself. Quietly, he wrote down the address printed on the back of one photograph. It belonged to a neighborhood in a city several hours away. As he closed the envelope and returned it to the bag, David made a decision that would change his life forever. 3 days later, Grace left for another business trip. She hugged David at the door and told him she would return in 2 days. Her voice was calm and affectionate, exactly the way it had always been. David hugged her back, but inside he felt hollow and uncertain. As soon as her taxi disappeared down the street, he entered his car and began driving toward the city written on the photograph. The long road felt endless, giving him too much time to think. Every memory of his marriage replayed inside his mind like a film. Birthdays, celebrations, promises, and quiet evenings suddenly felt fragile and uncertain. As the hours passed, David struggled with conflicting emotions. Part of him hoped he would arrive at the address and discover it was all a misunderstanding. Other part of him feared that he was about to confirm the destruction of his entire life. When he finally entered the unfamiliar neighborhood, the sun was already beginning to set. The streets were quiet, and children played outside small houses while neighbors greeted each other peacefully. David slowly drove until he found the address he had written down. When he stopped the car and looked toward the house, his breath froze in his chest. From inside his parked car, David saw Grace standing near the entrance of the house. She was laughing gently as two small children ran toward her. The children hugged her waist with excitement while she held them close with natural affection. A tall man soon appeared from the doorway and placed his arm around her shoulder. The four of them stood together like a perfect family. David felt his world collapse silently around him. The scene looked peaceful, loving, and completely real. Yet he knew he was watching the same woman who had shared his bed for 12 years. For a long time, David sat motionless in the car, trying to understand what he was seeing. The pain in his chest felt heavier than anything he had ever experienced. Everything he believed about his marriage now appeared to be built on a hidden foundation. Finally, with slow determination, David stepped out of the car and walked toward the house. His footsteps felt heavy as he approached the front door. When he knocked, the man from the photographs opened it. For several seconds, both men stared at each other in confusion, unaware that their lives were about to collide. David spoke first, introducing himself as Grace's husband. The man at the door looked shocked and confused, believing it was some kind of cruel joke. His name was Samuel, and he explained that Grace had been living with him for 7 years as his partner. They had built a life together in that house, raising the 2 children who called her mother. As the truth slowly unfolded between them, both men realized they had been living inside the same lie without knowing about each other. The discovery created a strange silence between them, filled with pain and disbelief. Grace had not returned home yet, so the 2 men sat quietly in the living room, struggling to process the reality of their situation. Neither of them felt anger toward the other. Instead, they shared the same wounded confusion. Samuel showed David family photos, school reports, and documents that proved Grace had been living this second life for many years. David's hands trembled as he looked through the evidence. The humiliation was overwhelming, but the pain was shared. In that moment, the two men realized they were not enemies. They were simply victims of the same hidden truth. When Grace finally arrived home that evening, she saw the two men sitting together in the living room. Her face instantly lost its color as she realized the secret had been exposed. For several seconds, no one spoke. The silence felt heavier than any argument could have been. David expected explanations, apologies, or anger. Instead, Grace looked overwhelmed and frightened. Without saying a single word, she slowly stepped backward toward the door. The weight of her double life had finally caught up with her, and she seemed unable to face the consequences. Before either man could react, Grace left the house and disappeared into the dark street outside. David and Samuel ran after her, but she was already gone. Calls to her phone were unanswered, and no one in the neighborhood knew where she had gone. The woman who had built two separate families had vanished completely, leaving behind confusion, broken trust, and children who would soon begin asking difficult questions. The house became quiet again, but the silence was now filled with the heavy reality of betrayal. In the following days, David returned home with a heart filled with grief and exhaustion. His children quickly noticed the sadness in his face. They asked him where their mother was and when she would return. Each question felt like a painful wound reopening inside him. David struggled to find answers that would not damage the innocence of their young minds. He simply told them that their mother had gone away for some time and that he would always be there for them. Although his voice sounded calm, the pain inside him remained deep. Meanwhile, Samuel faced the same situation with the two children who believed Grace was their mother. The strange connection between the two men slowly grew stronger as they continued communicating and supporting each other through the difficult days. They realized that their shared pain created an unexpected understanding between them. Instead of blaming each other, they chose to focus on protecting the children from the emotional damage caused by Grace's actions. In a strange way, the betrayal that destroyed their lives also created a bond neither of them expected. Several months later, David officially filed for divorce. Grace had still not returned, and no one knew where she had gone. At first, the humiliation felt unbearable, especially when neighbors began asking questions about the strange situation. Some people quietly wondered how a man could live 12 years with a wife and never notice her second life. But David slowly learned to ignore those whispers. He realized that his faithfulness had never been a weakness. Instead, it had shown the kind of man he truly was. David continued raising his children with patience and dedication, focusing on building a stable future for them despite the painful past. His friendship with Samuel remained strong, and the two men often supported each other like brothers who had survived the same storm. Over time, the anger and humiliation slowly faded, replaced by quiet strength and acceptance. David finally understood an old Igbo saying his father once told him, "What is done in the darkness will always meet the sunlight." The truth had destroyed the illusion of his marriage, but it had also revealed something stronger, his own character and the courage to rebuild his life.